Okay. Well, welcome to our next installment of Lexington Books Anthropology of Tourism author conversation series. I'm Michael Giovine. Oops, I just dropped everything. I was so excited. I'm Michael Giovine. I'm the editor of the book series and also a professor of anthropology here at Westchester University and the director of our Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology. We've been doing these conversations for several years now with the authors and editors of books, which are monographs or edited volumes within the Anthropology of Tourism, Heritage, Mobility, and Society series. I see some other authors and editors here in the audience, so thank you and welcome. I do want to give you just a really brief overview of that series in case you're thinking of either reading some of the books in it or possibly even reaching out and contributing a book in the series. Even though it has the word anthropology in it, and most of the people who are publishing are anthropologists. I mean, our guest today is an anthropologist, and I am. Really, anybody, they're really applicable to anybody. And certainly not all of the authors are anthropologists. We also have sociologists, linguists, cultural geographers, and others, political scientists who have contributed. So the Anthropology of Tourism, Heritage, Mobility, and Society series really is supposed to provides us with a lot of cutting edge and engaging research on the cultures of tourism. And you don't have to be an anthropologist to contribute to it. You just have to focus on our holistic and comprehensive approach to scholarship and have sort of a sensitivity, as anthropologists say we do, to the complex diversity of human expression. So we have a lot of great books. I'll just where is it? Where's my little, I love looking at all the books on the bookshelf. They all look very nice in that little row there. They focus on so many different things, from the newest one coming out is on gender, another one on cannabis tours, to well-being, and to tourism in China, and language and tourism, and apprenticeship pilgrimage, and all kinds of things. So we have a lot of rich diversity of books. However, and this is where we're going here, so I want to introduce the book we're talking about today, which is Cosmopolitanism and Tourism, edited by Robert Shepard. It's a wonderful book. Cosmopolitanism is deeply embedded in everything that tourism says it does, either as an oppositional category or as something that we do. So in some way, many of these books also deal with cosmopolitanism. So I'm really pleased to talk today with Robert Shepard. He teaches at George Washington University. He's also a tour, a study leader and a tour guide for Smithsonian Journeys and for lots of other organizations. So I love that the practice of tourism approach, as well as the academic tourism approach that you espouse. So welcome, Bob, and thanks so much for writing and editing such a really great book.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. One of the things I like about the book, besides the cover, and I was talking about this before, and the color, because we don't have many of the purple books in this series, so we got to get more of those, is the fact that it is both a very theoretical book, right? Your introduction is extremely, goes through the history of and development of the concept of cosmopolitanism from the Greeks and the Romans through the Enlightenment to even today, and how it shakes out in modern day tourism. But it's an edited volume, so you also bring in lots of other voices. And I've been an editor. I have a book out in this series as well that's an edited volume, and I think it's so important as an editor to make sure you have a cohesiveness, right? A real cohesiveness, despite different voices, different tones, different case studies. And I remember you writing the book, and certainly there was that cohesiveness. You have a very specific idea and understanding of what cosmopolitanism is, and you worked with the contributors to make sure that they kind of were cohesive in that fashion. I wonder, why don't you just, I don't know, let's start out by just taking us through maybe why you wrote this book to begin with, and what was your approach to kind of editing this with so many different people who have so many different experiences with tourism.
Well, to the second first, I mean, that was just allowing people to say what they want, to write what they want. And to the first question, I think I've always been I started out abroad in the Peace Corps in Nepal, in the middle of nowhere in Western Nepal. And my, as of, and I say this, I'm a great proponent of the Peace Corps. If any students listening are interested in the Peace Corps, email me. I'm happy to try to sell it to you. That said, Peace Corps people in the field can be pretty darn obnoxious. You get off and you're in the middle of nowhere by yourself, and then, I mean, the reality, and this was back in the 80s, even back then, I mean, no one's ever alone, right? First of all, I was living in a village with several hundred people. They just happened to be Nepali. And like a lot of Peace Corps people in my situation, because there weren't many foreigners around, when the occasional foreigner showed up, somebody would come running to the school and bang on the door and say, "Mr. Bob, sir, your friend's here." And it'd be, they varied, once in a while, we had a couple kind of sketchy missionary people working illegally, proselytizing. But, occasional other volunteers from the UK or Japan. But the one time it was a group of American rafters, and they're coming, we were in a little village along a river called the Seti River, Seti, and they were going down the Seti from the north towards the Indian border, which would have been, God, probably another 4 or 5 days from us. And they showed up like this group from the moon. They showed up with all this high-tech equipment and tents and freeze-dried food and gear. And what was interesting is they were clearly perturbed that I was there. I had been used to be like, this is my little town, what are you doing? And these guys showed up, and it seemed that really kind of hurt their experience to arrive in this little river bazaar town and see this big gangly American guy there. And that sort of got me thinking. It got me to be more reflective, I think, about my own conceits too, but it got me thinking about how in the space that tourists go, particularly, and I think we'll get to talk about this later, about this kind of romanticized notion of as Michael's book calls it, the quote anti-tourist experience. People who seek to travel, but they really they don't want to be called a tourist. So it really got me intrigued to start thinking about that, of what, whether, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I guess they were adventurers, I don't know what they were. We would get some tourists wandering through. At one point, I got a guy who was an editor for the Rough Guides, the early iteration of the Rough Guide. He was also really angry, clearly angry that I was there. And it got me thinking about how all these different types of people who don't belong to certain spaces, when they end up in these spaces, they are thinking themselves in the context of what they're not. And that's always sort of stuck with me. And then at GW for a long time, I was teaching courses in human rights and development, and sort of I found the same sense in those fields. And what really got me intrigued about cosmopolitanism is the whole international human rights narrative. To me, is a classic example of high modernist cosmopolitan idealism, right? I mean, to me, it's self-evident that the entire language of human rights is premised on this idea that all human beings should logically end up being liberal internationalists, for want of a better term.
Yeah.
Which, when you think of it, from an anthropological view, this makes absolutely no sense at all, right? So, and I kind of in my work have tried to put these together, this anti-tourist ideal of being a traveler to sort of experience the world. And yet many of those people are the exact same people who also embrace this kind of universalizing language of citizens of the world, or I guess the term would be global citizen, which to me, global citizen is a logical contradiction. I mean, it clearly is, right? There's no such thing as a global citizen. I mean, those passports don't exist. And The last thing I'll say is, if anything, I went and reread the chapter last night to make sure I remember what I had said. And, it was pre-Ukraine, and, people in Ukraine are not dying for universal rights or for the right to be a citizen of the world. They're dying to defend their country. And, I think it behooves us to recognize that the always suspect other of the cosmopolitan global citizen, i.e. the nationalist, is A, maybe not the enemy, and B, actually, a lot of people in the world we live in are very comfortable being nationalistic.
Mhm.
And I think it's dangerous to immediately dismiss that as dangerous, right?
Yeah.
So,
I want you to define cosmopolitanism, but I want to jump off
okay,
first and say something, which
okay.
I think is really interesting what you said, especially about Ukraine, because if you look at the origin of the term cosmopolitan, right, it comes from the ancient Greeks.
Mhm.
And being a citizen of the cosmos, right? There's
Yep.
the city of the oikumene kind of an idea, like global village and all this other stuff, but it was used negatively. It was
Mhm.
used negatively, right? The best proponent, the first person that's recorded of saying this was Diogenes, who my students in my intro class, we talk about him. He's a big pain in the neck, that was a thorn in Plato's side and everything. He was a cynic, and when they would say, "Well, where the hell are you from? Because you're such a pain in the ass," he would say, "Well, I'm a cosmopolitan. I'm a citizen of the world, not from Sinop," right? And that was a negative thing, right? So the idea was that, Aristotle would say that you are a citizen of a polis, of a
Mhm.
country, and that means that you're supposed to be fighting and you're supposed to be like your allegiance is supposed to be to those people. So
Yep.
even though we have this global village, you're playing off this kind of nationalism idea, but it kind of then emerges, right? And in the Enlightenment and everything, to have this kind of more liberal idea. So I don't know. I thought that was just so interesting
Yeah.
what you said, because it really does go back to the roots of the word cosmopolitanism. But what is cosmopolitanism? I mean,
Well, yeah, and I don't want to come off as if I'm an enemy of travel and cultural interaction. I'm not. I'm a strong proponent of it, but I mean, to me, it's, if we think of it in the context of tourism, I think it's that unspoken notion that the more you travel, the better life is.
Mm,
Almost like the more places you see, somehow, the more open you will become. And I don't really think that that's a bad notion, but I think it's critically important to recognize that this is it's a ideological perspective that comes from very specific societies, and B, in the world we live in, huge numbers of people are global, and yet often we tend to forget that a lot of the people who are actually authentically transnational are the underclass. It's the people from the global south who cut our grass
mhm.
and take care of our kids and do the crap service jobs. And I think I mentioned in the book, I'm in Alexandria, Virginia, and about a 15 minutes walk, there's a Walmart. And being an anthropologist, sometimes, I'll go over there on a Friday night and wander around. And, you know, I tell my students at GW, who, GW being GW, they're tend to be kids of a certain socioeconomic class, that if they really want to see the global reality in the world they live in, go to a Walmart on a Friday night.
Mm,
And that's what they're going to see. I mean, and it's filled with people from elsewhere, um,
mm.
who aren't from elsewhere. They're, my wife's from elsewhere. She's from Indonesia, and I don't think Fitri's unusual. I mean, she's not in America because she longs to be democratic or to be an American. I mean, it's a place in which there's more opportunity.
Mm.
So in the context of travel, I think cosmopolitan, I think it's a wonderful idea, but I think it doesn't get reflected on enough, that sometimes we may take it at the surface level of, yes, this is good. Travel is good.
So what you're saying is it's almost like a selective interpretation of a certain type of person that has interacted or come into contact with otherness on a more frequent basis, I think. Because yeah, I think it's really interesting what you said. Like, there are lots of global citizens. There are lots of people who literally are moving around all the time, and they're not necessarily what we mean by cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan has a class, almost like a class kind of a thing going on. It also has this idea that it's an ethical kind of a thing, right? It has an ethical dimension, how you ought to be.
Yeah.
You ought to, as you travel around, and there's other ways of being cosmopolitan, right? You could just be living in a very mixed kind of area, perhaps, like a cities are cosmopolitan, and lots of people who are of a certain, class, a certain political perspective, would see themselves as cosmopolitan, even if they're not traveling a lot, because they're coming into contact and supporting or tolerating diversity and otherness. And then you have other people who have to tolerate otherness, have to get along with it, have to acculturate, but yet we're not, we're just saying that they're not necessarily cosmopolitan.
Yeah, I guess, and to me, one of the paradoxes always has been how, I don't know how to phrase this, I think one of the kind of idealized outcomes of cosmopolitanism is this idea that a world of global citizens, right? Which, to me, again, the logical contradiction is it's premised that there's this endpoint in which we all come to think alike, and we share these same values. And yet, in the context of tourism, international tourism and domestic tourism, I think that idealized outcome actually needs the thing it wants to destroy. It needs the provincial, right? Why would someone go to Italy if Italians are essentially like middle-class Americans, right? Yeah. So that, to me, that's one of the really interesting things about it, that this desire, and I think you see the complexity of this in study abroad, where you've got all these variables that have to be accounted for. That, I mean, there's safety issues, right, and liability issues, and there's the issue of giving students an immersive experience. My sense is, in sort of talking to people who study how this plays out, is and observing it, particularly in places like in Bali in Indonesia, which I was there, just came back 2 weeks ago. For it to work, you need this kind of class of facilitators, don't you?
Yeah.
Folks on the ground who understand what the outside folks expect, and they become these kind of, I don't know what you call them, sort of intercultural brokers. But they themselves can't be too cosmopolitan, because for some of their guests, they may feel like, oh, they're not fake, they're fake, they're not really Balinese anymore.
Yeah.
And in some destinations, this seems to, people have become very skilled at that, it seems like, of I don't want to say packaging and presenting, it's not that simple, but in some sense that is what's going on, isn't it? Of presenting the other in a way that meets the expectations of those coming in.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, the idea of the tour guide or these intermediaries as brokers. I mean, Noel Salazar, who wrote Your Afterword.
Yeah.
I mean, he's written, a couple of things in different books of mine. One of them being in the book Tourism and the Power of Otherness. He writes about seducation that we read and talked about in class, right? That in I can't remember, Tanzania or wherever. Yeah. He was, that there are schools for tour guides that are essentially trying to make them cosmopolitans, but by making them in a way that they understand how to kind of manipulate and talk about different things in a way that would connect with the visitors. And again, if you're too far local, it's going to turn people off, right? If you start going in on the benefits of female genital mutilation or something, it's going to like get everybody upset, and you're not going to get any tips and all that other stuff. But then on the other end, if you're wearing Nikes, and you're Maasai, it's not going to do that. So almost like a good cosmopolitan could be one also that understands different cultural norms and values. But what's really interesting too is that these guys, and most of them were guys in this particular case, but these men and women who are guides, don't necessarily have to be travelers, right? They've never gone to America, right? They're only kind of learning about American tourists from their instructors or from films or whatever. Can you get cosmopolitan? Can you be cosmopolitan by, watching foreign films or not leaving? I mean, what do you think? Can you truly be cosmopolitan without mobility?
Well, that's something that Noel or Professor Salazar has written a lot about, I think, and it's a really vexing question. Also, Dave Geary in our book writes about this in the context of this exact same kind of cultural brokers at Bodh Gaya in India.
I love that
these
place.
These guys who can't, they're these Indian guys. They're not going to get a visa, right? And one of the things that he points out is how the internet has also facilitated this, where they're able to maintain these personal relationships that they build in person. Going on, and this is a kind of, it may sound weird, but it's sort of on point. And as I mentioned before, I spent half my life on Chincoteague Island. I think some of your students may have visited. We're down off the coast of Virginia, and we're famous for our wild horses that supposedly come from the Spanish, blah, blah, blah. And when my wife and I, bought a little house down there 6 years ago now, started hanging out, I became fascinated by these exact same topics. I mean, Chincoteague Island's got 3,000 year-round residents, maybe 25,000 in summer. It's a international destination. Politically, I don't know how to say this to be polite, but it's safely to the right. If you're on the ballot and you're with the Republican Party, you're not going to lose unless you're in jail, and even then you might get elected. But these guys, my neighbors, it's kind of like what you see in Kenya. They're really adept at knowing what people expect from them. The whole saltwater cowboy and the good old boy thing. And, because of where Chincoteague is, everyone I know on the island, either they or someone in their family either is involved in tourism or they work for the federal government. Because the NASA's there and NOAA's there, the Navy's there, the Fish and Wildlife's there, Park Service is there. So they're deeply embedded into the national government and tourism. And yet, come the summer and the high season with our carnival and everything, they're also really good at putting that aside and putting on their persona of being the good old boys from this little offshore island. And much like where Dr. Salazar points out in with the Maasai in Kenya, my neighbors don't seem to see any contradiction in this. They don't have any kind of existential crisis of like who I am. They're in the language of anthropology, they're performing, aren't they? But when we bring back the cosmopolitanism, I think from an anthro view, tourism is always about performance. Everybody's performing. And when people travel, they're performing, right? And a lot of research shows this. And, it again kind of grates up against the ideals of what it means to be cosmopolitan and authenticity, right? And, I sometimes wish that that's the one word in English that we could get rid of, because it just simply, to me, carries no meaning at all. And I say that not in some kind of postmodern vacuous sense, that this, for the life of me, I have no clue what would not be authentic in any context at all, right? Because if it's human action, it's human action, right?
Yeah, no, it's really, really interesting. I really like this idea. I try to get, through to especially intro students, this idea that what we do is often a performance. We perform gender, we perform class, by what we wear, how we behave, how we talk, all that kind of stuff, right? I mean, travel is such an integral part, right? And the playing out and performing cosmopolitanism is really important. I mean, that's pretty much, it's built in, like, how cosmopolitan are you? I remember, speaking of Virginia, and I'm not going to name names, but I was a tour operator, myself, before going back to grad school. And I would take a lot of alumni associations around, and a Virginia college, deep, more deep South Virginia college, right? They had a fantastic travel program because the director of that program would give, those, like, in the old days, you see those old pictures of the luggage with like Rome, Paris, like these stickers. He would give those things when they did one of these trips. He would have one designed special for the trip, and then, he'd give them out. And his clientele, like these alumni, would kind of fight over, like, compete who had more of these. And so they'd all be buying these expensive trips so that they could show, right? They could perform their cosmopolitanism.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they were such that, how cosmopolitan were they? They were often not, they were traveled, but they weren't, let's say, well traveled. I mean, they didn't go to a lot of diverse places. They went to Italy a lot, right? Like they went to London, but how many, I don't think we did any tours to Southeast Asia for them. That wasn't really their interest, to do. And so, how much of their perspective they can have is kind of, but they were performing their cosmopolitanism, right?
Yeah.
They're performing this even by the stickers that they had.
Well, and I think that raises a really key point, is that, sometimes I feel like in tourism studies, we're kind of guilty of overemphasizing certain types of travel.
Mm-hmm.
So we spend a lot of time thinking about travel in the context of, people's kind of search for themselves, or or becoming global citizens. And I don't think we spend enough time recognizing that, I'll go off on a limb, gross stereotype, but the vast majority of people who go on vacation may not have any interest in this stuff at all, right? They're going on vacation, and we don't have terms for this. What do you call on Chincoteague Island? And I know this from studying the community Facebook page has 14,000 members.
Mm-hmm.
3,000 people live on an island. So obviously almost everyone on that page doesn't live there. And what's interesting is there are people on there who have gone on vacation to the same island for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, multi-generations.
Yeah.
And, they're traveling. But for them, travel is going back to what they know.
Yeah.
And it to me is a part of travel that we just, maybe as scholars, are not paying enough attention to.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. I mean, yeah,
like
you're absolutely right. Like the transformative potential. I mean, cosmopolitanism suggests some sort of transformation that, other theories, let's say Nelson Grayburn's, classic theory, right? That it's not about transformation as much as it's about the ritual of relaxation, of breaking away from the workaday rigors, right? And you need a break, a rite of intensification to kind of recenter you. And, like we were talking before this started. I mean, I go every year with a bunch of friends, like our families all go together, not too far from Chincoteague, right, to Outer Banks, to Corolla. And that's my friend's happy place. Like he goes there every year. He enjoys it. And he's a high-powered finance person. And he just needs to get away for a while, and recharge the batteries. It's a very Nelson Grayburn thing, but he's not being cosmopolitan. He's cosmopolitan all the time because he's flying in his private jet all over the country and all over the world doing things. So he's getting it other ways. But when he's doing tourism, he's like, I just want to like drink some beer and like hang out.
Yeah. It's a kind of travel in which the goal is not to embrace the unknown or define oneself. It's to literally go to what one knows already.
Right.
And my gut feeling is that, as scholars, we have been so enraptured with this more romanticized notion of the grand tour, going back to the grand tour, that we either ignore this huge segment of the market, or we kind of turn up our noses at it, which is quite puzzling to me. I mean,
well, then let me just follow this up, because I know we were also asking this question. So why do you think that this is built in? This idea of cosmopolitanism is often built into the idea of tourism. Like you're going to travel and you're going to have some of these experiences, or you're going to be like, the more trips you rack up, more of those stickers you rack up, you're going to necessarily be more of a global citizen. We're comfortable in the world, comfortable with diversity. I know a lot of these guys that were not at all cultural relativists, that have traveled a lot of times, you know.
Um, so you mean in the
So my question
context
is
of,
like, why is cosmopolitanism often thought to be a necessary outcome of tourism?
I think a big part of it is that we don't spend enough time as scholars kind of looking at ourselves of who we are and our own positionality,
Mm, mm,
that it might be that, you know, we're weirdos, right? I mean, we spend a huge amount of time in school, right? And you know, grad school and university life, as we know, is quite different from life out there. I don't
yeah,
want to talk about the academy and all that, but we're closeted away, and I think sometimes maybe we're projecting our own desires onto those we study, perhaps, or those we choose not to study.
sure.
You
Well,
know,
also
so
probably, as anthropologists too, we are very close to travel, to
yeah,
tourists, and Ed Brunner and others have really talked about this, right? Um, there's a lot of similarities, let's say. And of course, the whole point is that we are transforming, that we're gaining new knowledge. We're going to write something, we're going to produce something. And of course, let's be honest, anthropologists are often, at least today, are supposed to be pretty, cultural relativists, right? Like
yeah,
pretty relativist when it comes to like cultural diversity, pretty accepting and if not tolerant of diversity. And that's, tolerance, right? That's a big thing that comes up a lot in the book and in the
yeah,
introduction and stuff, like in definitions of cosmopolitanism. I mean, you're moving from the political, right? The early ideas of what cosmopolitanism was about the politics of it. Even Kant and everyone you talk about, right? It was about like everybody should have like just one passport and like travel around. We should be able to life, liberty, and property wherever the hell we want, not just in our own nation state. But in the current day, especially with like, study abroad, how we market study abroad, we're saying, look, this is about being open and reflexive as you encounter the other and being comfortable with diversity.
yeah.
So then my question becomes, if this is true, like, how do you, and this is something that came up in our class too, how do you balance the cultural relativism that you're supposed to have as a cosmopolitan, as a mobile cosmopolitan, you're going to be more, let's say, accepting of different traditions, uh, with making actual ethical judgments and ethical judgments, really, about cultures, right? There could, as you interact with more and more cultures. I mean, there's something about Dubai in here, is a good example, right? As you interact with more and more cultures, you might be very relativistic and very open, but can you still say, well, you know what? I just think what they're doing is wrong, or the way they're treating
I
women is
are you
wrong,
asking
or whatever.
if you're asking me personally, maybe because I'm old and cranky now, but to me, I don't see a contradiction. I think, I've spent since the 90s, I spent a lot of time in China, lived in China, lived in Taiwan, and been back and forth to China, well, until COVID and until
Mhm.
Xi Jinping shut down China. But, there's, you know, I've spent a long time, particularly because I'm in Washington and I do some work with the State Department too. I'm sort of trying to be a voice of reason against the clamor of anti-Chineseness. But I don't find it that difficult to urge people to seek to understand why others are different, with in doing so also being able to say, you know, I'm so glad I don't live here with you guys full time, or I'm so glad
Mhm.
I'm not you.
Mhm.
And I think you know, I don't know if you call that critical relativism
Mhm.
or reflective relativism. I'm not quite sure the term, but it's if I can turn it around, and to bring it back to the beginning of the conversation, I think too that one of the things about these kind of cosmo ideals of how everyone should be in the world is the expectation that everyone in the world will think like that,
Yeah.
and they clearly don't. I mean,
Right.
last week I was in Jakarta with my in-laws, and having a 82-year-old uh, mother-in-law who's a devout Muslim who has some really interesting things to say about Kafirs, like me, and it's, it's, sometimes I think like, geez, I'm glad you're not with us in DC because people freak out at what you're saying. Like, but then, it's like, this is the world we live in. And I think one of the dangers of study abroad is making it too safe. It has to be safe. I get that. The physical safety and mental health support, things like that. It's hard to, when you're young, to go off for a semester in the middle of nowhere, even if you're with a cohort.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I think we need to think more about this expectation of, people. Why would people, in a small village in Nepal, think about life the way I do? It just
Mm-hmm.
it just beggars beyond belief to think they would, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's if the mantra of cosmos/multiculturalism is diversity, 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 one of the contradictions I find is often people who voice this actually aren't really interested in diversity.
Right.
When it comes to ideology and worldviews, I mean, they just expect everybody will be, kind of in an American sense, liberal, progressive, open-minded, and all these things. And they're not, right? That's the world we live in. And
Well, then you're
the last
closed
thing I'll
off.
say
Some
is,
are closed off to people who aren't seen as this open-mindedness, or they espouse some different political or
yeah,
ethical perspectives, right?
yeah.
And
So
it also presupposes the privilege, right? That's what
yeah,
you're also talking about.
yeah, and that ultimately, whatever form of tourism we're talking about, we have to recognize it's a occupation that is accessible to some people, not to others.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're kind of blunt enough about that,
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm gonna pause for a second and say that, I do want some, especially some of the students who are here. Maybe you want to pop a question in
Yeah.
the Q&A so that we can, maybe in a minute, we can kind of call on some people. And anybody, not just my students, anybody who has questions, that would be great to hear from you. What do you think about cosmopolitanism?
And also about
Yeah.
tourism and just why, what is the purpose of tourism? And I would just say, I might be completely wrong, and I'm quite happy to admit that. So, any question is great. If you want to tell me that you completely disagree with me, awesome. That's great.
Mhm.
And-
So we do have some, can I call you? I'm going to call you up. All right. And, Katie, that's a good question too. So let me call, actually, let me start with Katie, and then I'll, call on David here. So Kathleen or Katie, let's put you up here. I'm going to promote you to a panelist. Look at you. Where are you? You're going to pop up in a second. And then I'm also going to pull David Alonso up. Yeah. So you want to ask your question?
Sure. Do you want me to put my camera on?
Yeah, if you
or
want. If you want.
Okay. I'm like in my room right now, so I'll keep it
Yeah,
off.
sure, it's fine.
But yeah, my question was, can you, oh, hold on, I just lost it. So silly. My question was, could religious missions be considered voluntourism or cosmopolitanism? Like, is voluntourism another way to say modern colonialism? And I'm thinking like a lot of like Mormonism and like Catholic, like those missions that they take to like third world countries.
That's a great question, Katie. Yeah. So you're taught specifically, you're asking about voluntourism in the context of the religious people, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That's a tough one. I mean, so is to me, it is a form of tourism. And I think it's I mean,
Religious, yeah.
I'm not very, I was raised for Catholic. I'm not very religious. And I've always found it puzzling why people would want to go to someone else's society and try to convince them to believe in something different. But that said, that's what a lot of, I spent a long time, a decade in international development. And I think that's exactly what international development is. It's a secular form of religious tourism / voluntourism, but they don't want to admit that, so in that sense, I don't think that religious proselytizing tourism is all that different than international development. I think it carries the same problems. The underlying premise is that the people in these places are lacking something, which might be the case, but often might not be. It's simply, well, they're not lacking it. It's just that what they have or believe is what I think they should not have or believe. Right?
Can I follow up with that? So let's lump together, and it's unfair, but like the voluntourists who are going there, right? Because they want to help, apparently. And of course, Mary Mustafinejad and everybody, they've written some really great stuff on, it's perpetuating the same problems that they're trying to, help overcome and everything else. And of course, the religious missions are very similar in that respect, in that they're kind of going there, like you said, because you're lacking something, you're lacking the true understanding of the true God and stuff like that. Can they ever be cosmopolitan? I mean, certainly I would say that, especially in the case of Mormonism or in other types of missionary focused religions where they send out like the young kids, very similar to a grand tour. They can't just be proselytizing. It's also about getting out, doing the walkabout before they come back to their society. And I guess they're trying to make them more globally aware before they're kind of insulated again. But if you're going with the mindset that I'm right and you're wrong, or something like that, or I'm trying to change your mind, let's say, can that ever achieve cosmopolitanism? I don't know if you have a.
Yeah, no, I'm in full agreement.
Yeah. Let me let's ask Sadie's up here. So let me Sadie, you took my study abroad program, you read the study abroad chapter in the book. You want to ask, and if you want to turn on, I don't know if you want to turn on your camera, but you could certainly do that.
Sure. Hi, Dr. Shepard. It's nice to meet you. I really enjoyed reading the chapter. It really resonated with me. As Dr. Giovine, I studied abroad.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I had a great time. But some of the questions I had, what I kind of pulled from your chapter was that those individualized and spontaneous experiences that students end up having are the ones that end up being more meaningful or impactful for them. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how study abroad facilitators could better kind of set up those experiences for study abroad students to have.
That's a great question. And that's
criticizing
kind of
me, how I'm setting up the experience?
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
No, I feel like some of those spontaneous experiences that were talked about in the chapter, those were the ones that really resonated with me because I felt lucky enough to have them.
Yeah. Well, I would say that, the trick is, and say that this because you went abroad, right? And it's, needing those parameters of safety, mental health and physical health and diet, all these things. But then, to me, being abroad, these you're talking about those, what I guess we call like authentic experiences and not planned. And to me, it's always, that's the premise. Like, you can't plan authenticity. It just can't. At best, you're going to get some kind of outcome in which you're measuring what happened versus what you expected to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, real experiences are, they're not out of the ordinary. They may well be ordinary, but they're just not expected. Your bus breaks down, right? And you get stuck in a little town for an hour, and you get off the bus while the guy fixes the tire, and you talk to somebody. That's authenticity. And it's to me, that's the beauty of study abroad. Those moments of the unexpected surprises, that the things you remember, right? One example, I took a group of undergrads from GW on a spring. We did a course in which over spring break we went to China for 10 days back in 2016. That was crazy. And we were in Beijing. We still had class and we'd go to see all the different typical tourist sites. But then the one afternoon, they had a kind of a mini anthro exercise where they had to go off on their own and see something. So this group of 5 or 6 students decided to go off. There was this bizarre, broken down amusement park in Beijing that's gone now, but back then it was called The World. It had been built in the 1990s when Chinese people couldn't go abroad. And, you know, so it was just like this bizarre world in miniature of like a tiny World Trade Center and a tiny Eiffel Tower. They had a blast. They came back and they were like, that was the most amazing thing. It was so weird and so unexpected. And, you know, that's what they remembered from China. But to me, it's like, that's it. That's great. That's awesome. Right. So, you know, I guess I didn't answer it, but then the catch-22 is you can't plan these, can you? I mean, you can create the space in which the potential's there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, as somebody who's planned study abroad programs, I mean, I try hard to at least routinize or normalize, you know, this kinds of the types of experience and put them out so that experiences can happen.
Yeah.
You know, at the end of the day, you know, this is another thing that I was thinking about in terms of cosmopolitanism. It is built into study abroad. I mean, we promise in study abroad, I promise you that you're going to become more cosmopolitan or more global citizen, right? Otherwise, what's the point of taking a class and, you know, like, you know, that's more expensive somewhere else than you could do just right here in this building, you know? And of course, the fact of the matter is now, you know, Sadie knows my own study abroad program, we're trying to get out in the world and we do ethnography and we talk to people and stuff, you know, I'm making those experiences so that you can have those serendipitous experiences. But a lot of the other programs that are hosted as well with mine in Italy, in this town in Perugia, you know, they're like, you know, I'm doing physics in the lab in Italy instead of in our hometown. But it's what happens afterwards that's what's important, and the professor has nothing to do with it at all. Like it's just because I'm putting you here in this town. Now go out when we're not in class, and you're going to have a different experience. You know, so we do have 2 other questions here. I don't know. There are comments and questions. Jim, I think you popped up first. You want to ask or the comment that you have?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, thanks very much. I really enjoyed the talk. So I'm joining you from the UK, and I wanted to make a point that resonates, I think, with what the speaker said. But I don't know if you've come across it over here in the UK. There's a writer and commentator called David Goodhart, and he wrote a book in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum. I can't remember the name of the book now, but it was all about looking at Britain as very divided between citizens of somewhere, citizens of a place, rooted to place, Britain in this case. And then on the other hand, citizens of nowhere, the cosmopolitan, professional, liberal, professional managerial class, if you like. I think that's a term that's in use now. And he argues that there's a very, very strong class element to this as well. Rooted people who have to look to the democracy within, you know, as citizens within a bounded national territory, because that's what they have, versus people who have the sort of social and intellectual capital and the credentials to go and work off in Europe and so on. So he argues there's a very strong class element to this whole discussion about cosmopolitanism. And I tend to agree. I think that in the discussion specifically about tourism, you know, the traveller tourist thing is a sort of parallel to that, I think, whereby those of us who are loose and travellers and doing field work, and maybe people who are academics who've worked in different countries, do, unfortunately, still to this day, tend to look down somewhat on people who take a holiday for 2 weeks to refresh themselves. So they have to work hard the other 50 weeks of the year.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I would just add, I 100% agree. And the paradox in the US is because of Trump, right? The impact of Trump is everywhere. And it's on conversations like this, right? They're become more difficult to have because it's this reductionist notion of those who are making your point, oh, you're Trumpers, which to me is absurd. It's like, no, there are a lot of people particularly, in democracies, those who are elected to represent the people electing them, right? So, and I see this with my neighbors down the island. That they're not all bigots and white nationalists, and they just find it bizarre that why would the people we elect focus so much on these abstract international issues? What about the water problem we have, which we have a big water problem there, and Trumpism has made these more difficult, I think, these conversations.
Yeah. Talking about that, I mean, Paul, you had a great kind of comment. Did you want to ask that? That was really interesting.
Yeah, sure. So I used to work for a big hotel company, and we were launching into a project to really increase expansion, especially into Africa and other emerging market destinations. And it was, for me, I wondered about how we were going about that. And the backstory was, when I was a little kid, I live in British Columbia, Canada, but when I was a little kid, I twisted the dial on my radio because I wasn't into music. And until I heard something that was interesting to listen to. And I found myself listening to Radio Moscow World Service. And it took me as a 10-year-old kid quite a while until I figured out that the war they were talking about on the radio, on their news, was the same war we were watching, the Vietnam War, on TV here, except that when they told the story, we were the bad guys. So when we launched our big expansion plans into Africa, I wrote a memo to our senior management and asked the question. I told them that little backstory, and then I asked the question: Have we asked ourselves about how we're going to be perceived when we go into these markets? Do we ask ourselves, what if we're the bad guys in their view? So, long story short, are we going in to help the emerging market emerge, or are we going in to just exploit the greater profit margins that we can get there? The CEO was in my office at 7 a.m. the next morning, but he actually just stuck his hand out and said, "Thanks. No, we didn't ask that question. We should have." So my question was kind of around the discussion on volunteerism and things like that, and maybe even study abroad programs. Do we ask ourselves the questions about not only what are we going to see and how are we going to perceive that, but how are we going to be perceived when we go to new places and meet new people? So this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. Bob, you want to take that on? No,
Yeah. I guess that's always been the big question in tourism, right? The from the reception end, right? How do people want this? And the only places I really am somewhat competent enough to talk about would be in China, and then not so much Indonesia proper, but Java and Bali. And in China, the paradox is that even pre-COVID, almost all the tourists are Chinese, something like 98, 99%. So there's actually, relatively speaking, very few foreign tourists in China. They've never really been that many. And when there are, often then it's overseas Chinese from the region. I just, as I mentioned, I just came back. I was in Southeast Asia for a month and spent some time in Bali at a place called Sanur, which is interesting because, and I think Catherine Adams is here and she would know this too, that Sanur is ground zero for tourism in Bali. That was where tourism began in the 1920s when it was still under Dutch control. And, it's a place where at this point, we're talking about what, 4-5 generations of people, 100 years in which to think about tourism as something foreign in not just Bali, but Sanur particularly, I don't think really makes sense anymore. I mean, it's part of the fabric of life. And and it's in that sense, I think when we flip it around and is it all that different, say, for people who grew up in New York, particularly ground in New Yorkers from like Staten Island or or from the Bronx, right? You know, they live in this city that for generations, millions of people from all the world want to come to and go to. And, you know, it's, you know, it is what it is. It's not going to stop. I don't think tourism, and it's, you know, I think one of the good things that anthropologists have been able to do is to, you know, whether if it's in Africa or in Asia, other parts, to kind of show how often on the receiving end, people are quite adept at figuring out not just what foreign tourists want, but also how do you extract value from them in a way that doesn't make them realize you're extracting value. So in other words, you're giving them a good time, you're giving them good performance, they're going home happy, and you're getting something out of it. And to me, that's the ultimate issue. You know, it's, you know, do tourism projects serve the people who live there?
Right. I think
And if
just
all tourism was like Cancun, then the answer would be no. I mean,
right.
but luckily, a lot of tourism isn't like Cancun, right? So,
I mean, to piggyback off of that, I think the one thing that the anthropology of tourism has kind of shown is that, you know, there's been a lot of critical appraisals of, you know, tourism development projects. You know, being on, and I would imagine, Paul, you're on the same networks as we are, you know, TriNet and stuff like that, where you have a diversity of people working in the tourism sector and in tourism academia. There's often this divide, right? The business schools and hospitality schools tend to think about the business of it and how it's always going to help. That same kind of almost tired discussion about how much, you know, how good is done when you're doing development. And then the others are kind of talking about how, well, it's a very vertically integrated kind of you know, a set of industries that, you know, if it's not done correctly, it's going to be very extractive, like you were saying. And obviously there's a midpoint in there. And I think COVID really brought that out, because especially for anthropologists who are criticizing tourism a lot in tourism development projects, you know, how we're putting such strain and pressures on the local communities. And then when we stopped, which, you know, we have to remember, COVID started in 2020 for America, right? And China started a little earlier, right? But in 2019 and 2018 were the big summers of anti-tourism protests, where tourists go home, and, you know, all the Barcelona and Dubrovnik and Venice, they would kick us out. You know, there's too much pressures. And then what happened? For the first time ever, we all went home, and then they were suffering. You know, because we saw that it's not so easily disentangled, right? That there's a give and take. And, you know, so I think that we need to think better, especially as we're reopening in the last year and continuing. I mean, we're not up to the same levels as we were in 2019, but we've certainly jumped. You know, how can we do this better, where there's more like mutual kind of understanding, asking those questions, Paul, that you were asking? Right? How, you know, how can both mutually benefit? And benefits don't have to be quantifiable. You know, a lot of places,
exactly.
right? They don't have to be. There could be the valorization of, like, you know, being able to explain things that have this cultural, there's lots of different ways that.
If I could just have one thing going off what Michael said, and this is to the students, right? You're looking for a senior project. A rich topic to unpack is Airbnb and Vrbo. And, you know, because on the one hand, it's been sold to us as the great democratization of the tourism industry. Everyone can be a tourist vendor now. On the other hand, what we see it's doing, it's destroying the commons, right? That you know, and we see this on the island, on Chicoteague Island, where I live. Close to half the houses now have been bought up and turned into vacation rentals. And it's hollowing out the community. It's impacting the schools. It's impacting the tax base. And these are questions that really only now, I think, anthropologists are starting to look at them. So it's a huge topic, and I think it's critically important, because it's you know, if it continues the way it is without any regulation, I'm quite bleak about it. It's just, you know.
Yeah. And I think that was a lot of the problems with the anti-tourism, you know, protests of the 2018, 2019, was the fact that it's kind of pushing out in ways that hotels even didn't, you know, pushing out locals. And then you're not getting the taxes, like, you know, They're now secondary residences, investment residences, so you're not getting all those property taxes to invest in the schools and everything, and it is decimating the fabric of the community.
Yeah.
You know, but any other thoughts or questions? I mean, we're at the 1 hour mark here, so we don't want to drag on too long, but I think, you know, some of these are really great questions. They go beyond cosmopolitanism. But yeah, any other thoughts? I'm looking at this. Kathleen, who had to leave, did say that she completely agrees with what Jim said. Between cosmopolitanism and social capital, class performance is important even when she was teaching at semester at sea. Yeah.
I'll add one thing, and I'm still trying to get my head around it. And I just spent, when I was in Asia, I spent 2 weeks as a cultural lecturer on I won't name the line, but like a super 5-star luxury cruise line. And I've never done that before, and I'm still sort of trying to figure out my take on it, you know, because in essence, my wife and I boarded in Mumbai in India, spent 2 weeks with this group of 500, obviously very, very, very affluent, mainly retired, winners of global capitalism, for want of a better way, floating through the global south on this luxury ship in which we could pull into a port, people could get off and dabble their feet, you know, and see local sites, then come back on their ship and, you know, eat prime rib and lobster that they had from Maine, and, you know, drink excellent wine and float on. You know, it's, in many ways it's dystopian, profoundly dystopian, and it really doesn't seem to have anything at all to the local economies, right? I mean, the ports almost are secondary to the reality that, you know, you know, capitalism can create a market in anything, right? It's created a market in which very rich people can float around the world in this 5-star luxury, and, you know, but you know, the folks on the boat were very amiable, and, you know, there were people who spent a lot of time talking about all the countries they visited on these ships, which to me, they didn't really visit anywhere.
Right. They're performing that cosmopolitanism.
Yeah.
And then how cosmopolitan were they? Because it goes back to that same question you asked in the beginning, like, you know, what are they coming for? Are they coming for interacting with and understanding new cultures and communities? Or are they coming for the very luxurious experience of being on a boat, or both? Right. And can you have one or the other? You know, I have one question for you, and then maybe we can end it. As you get more and more, as you travel more and more, and you're getting more and more cosmopolitan, does it like plateau out, and then you just like, you've seen it all, and so you get more jaded or something? I mean, like, is there like a life cycle of cosmopolitanism, or in general? I mean, can you be too much of a citizen of the world and get disenchanted with the notion? I mean, how does that work? That sounds like a stupid question, but anyway.
No, I think it, you know, and it's a good way to end too. It's really driven by class status, I think, and class privilege, and you know, I think was it Jim who pointed out that, you know, you don't need, when you're rich enough, you don't need the protections of citizenship, right? Although I'm sure when those people get locked up somewhere in Southeast Asia, they're on the phone to the U.S. Embassy as you know, as soon as possible. But, you know, it's, you know, I think the entire premise is a luxury, you know, and you know, it's to be a citizen of the world only makes sense if you have these material privileges that can, you know, make that idea even feasible for you. And you know, as for the ones who seek it, I mean, I personally find it an odd goal in life to constantly try to identify with elsewhere. But I think, you know, particularly for researchers, and I said this at the beginning, I think we may have spent way too much time focused on this one aspect of travel and completely neglect the Michaels who go to the same place they travel, and I'm like you too, Michael, same place every year, and we might be much more reflective of the world at large, right? That people will be mobile, but in some sense they're being mobile to find that which they're familiar with.
Yeah. But
they return.
And you're finding yourself too. I mean, not to cut you off,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I guess the better articulation of my question is, as you rack up these more, let's say, quality experiences with otherness, you're going to be, and let's say you are being really reflexive about who you are. Shouldn't the outcome be that you are getting more comfortable with who you are and your own particular ideas of what is right and wrong and how things should be, because you're kind of, as I know so many people who are very mobile high class people, right? And they're more like, this is right and this is wrong.
Yeah.
They become less open-minded,
Yeah.
although that could also be the life cycle, right? As you get older, you start to get, crotchety, but that maybe you do start to, like, the end goal is like, I need to know who I am, right? I need to know what I really feel about things.
Well, I'm a little more sympathetic to them than you, but with the Smithsonian Journeys program, that's what I find. I mean, it's quite expensive, right? And it has a very particular demographic of older, usually retired folks who are still physically able to do some hard travel, albeit every night they're staying in a 7-star hotel. What I have found among, traveling with those folks in China is that there's not a lot of interest in trying to understand the other. And it may not be in a sort of a close-minded way. It's just, they're successful and they've accumulated a lifetime of experiences. And, I was always intrigued, because on these trips we'd be going down, part of it would be going down the Yangtze River in English, right? And usually on these trips you've got retired engineers or folks like that, and it's fascinating talking to them because they don't care about, they want to look at a temple, they're looking at these brand new bridges, and they're saying like, this is really interesting, look at the span of this thing, look at the depth of the river and the rapids, so they're experiencing it, but in a way that I never would imagine, but if I were to say to them, like, are you finding out more about yourself? I think they'd look at me like I was weird. Like, I don't need to find out anything about myself. I know who I am.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. They're great people. I mean, I ran Smithsonian Journey tours myself as a tour operator. We were one of those operators that did them. And, I was 21 years old, 22, 23 years old. And so for me, of course, I was looking at it as like everything is a learning experience, including dealing with these people, right? These clients. But yeah, absolutely. I saw the same thing. I mean, yeah. So I guess this is a good place to end. I mean, again, thanks, Bob, so much for a really stimulating and thought-provoking conversation. There's so much more to talk about. All of the contributors just had really great essays. I mean, I know we didn't get to talk about a lot of them. The one on Dubai flight attendants, especially, is very interesting. I mean, that's great. All that, Adam's buskers and Claire's food, in Bolivia, all really, really varied things. Brings up a lot of important points on the ways in which, both theoretically and how, practically Cosmopolitan kind of shakes out through tourism in different areas. So I do recommend the book, of course. But it's the book is Cosmopolitanism and Tourism. And, I really thank all of you for being here and asking such great questions. So thanks so much. And thank you, Bob, for being here today.
Yeah. And if anyone on the East Coast or West Coast or in between, come July, come on down to Chickadee Island. That's our big horse roundup and carnival. And, we're all well trained. We're really good at performing down there. So, and everyone, you have a good time.
Great. Thanks so much.
All right.
All right.